Historical records often blur the line between legend and reality, but across the centuries, a few individuals left a paper trail of impossible bravery. Acts of defiance that were so significant they were verified by the very enemies who witnessed them. These 7 men were more than just soldiers. They were the rare individuals who stood firm at a turning point in history, holding the line when an entire era was on the verge of collapse. Alexander the Great had spent years winning impossible battles, but in a fortified city in India, his luck finally reached its limit. It was here where his massive empire nearly came to a violent and premature end. By 325 BC, the campaign had reached the Punjab region. The troops were exhausted, and when they reached the walls of the Malian capital, they hesitated. To shame his men into action, Alexander grabbed a ladder and scaled the battlements, followed by only 2 or 3 of his most loyal guard. The soldiers below rushed to join him, but in the chaos, the wood snapped, leaving Alexander alone on the walls of the citadel. Then, in a move that was either legendary or suicidal, he leapt down into the city, completely cutting himself off from his own army. He was the most powerful man in the world, yet he found himself trapped against a tree, fighting off a city's worth of defenders. The Malians realized who they had in their crosshairs, and they closed in. During the frenzy, a heavy arrow pierced Alexander's breastplate and sank deep into his lung. He continued to fight, losing blood, losing air, until he finally collapsed. His soldiers eventually broke through the gates in a blind rage to save their king. But the damage was done. Alexander's survival was a miracle, but it left him scarred for the rest of his short life. He died 2 years later in Babylon, at just 32 years old. Alexander's leap was an act of aggressive conquest. But 1,200 years later, another king would take a similar risk. Not to capture a city, but to rescue one from certain destruction. In the summer of 1192, during the Third Crusade, the city of Jaffa was on the verge of falling to the forces of Saladin. The Christian defenders had been pushed back to the citadel, and the banners of the Crusader army had already been torn down. When Richard the Lionheart's fleet arrived, they saw the walls lined with enemy soldiers. His own advisors told him the city was already lost and urged him to sail away. But Richard refused to retreat. In a moment of pure tactical madness, he shouted, "Cursed be he who does not follow me," and leaped from his galley into the waist-deep surf. Armed with a crossbow and a sword, the King of England waded ashore, leading a force of only 80 knights and a few hundred archers. They charged straight into an army of thousands. According to Bahar ad-Din, the personal secretary to Saladin, who witnessed the battle from the shore, the shock of the king's arrival was so overwhelming that the trapped defenders inside the city regained their courage and launched a desperate counterattack. Saladin's forces, caught between the king in the surf and the emboldened garrison in the city, were driven back in a total panic. The next morning, with his back to the sea and his small force outnumbered 10 to 1, Richard rode out in front of Saladin's lines, defiantly daring any man to come out and face him. According to the records of Saladin's own chroniclers, not a single soldier stepped forward. They were paralyzed by the sheer audacity of a man who refused to move. Richard had saved the city through the sheer force of his presence. But 16 centuries earlier, a Spartan king led a small force into a narrow mountain pass, knowing from the first step that there would be no victory, only a delay. In 480 BC, Spartan king Leonidas I led a small vanguard to the coastal pass of Thermopylae to block a Persian invasion of over 100,000 men. While history remembers the 300, Leonidas was actually commanding a diverse Greek force of about 7,000. But the real history is in the tactics. The hot gates were so narrow that the Persian cavalry was useless. and their shorter spears couldn't reach the Spartans behind their massive bronze shields. For 2 days, the Persians suffered thousands of casualties, while the Greeks barely lost a man. The situation only changed because of a local named Ephialtes, who showed the Persians a hidden mountain path. When Leonidas realized he was being surrounded, he didn't just stay. He performed a strategic sacrifice. He sent the majority of the Greek army home so they could live to fight another day, choosing to stay behind with his Spartans and a few hundred volunteers to cover their escape. Under Spartan law, retreat was a crime punishable by social death, losing all rights as a citizen. Leonidas chose a physical death instead. He was killed early in the final struggle. And according to Herodotus, the Spartans fought with such ferocity to protect the fallen Leonidas that they successfully recovered his body 4 times, driving back the Persian immortals even as their own lives were being extinguished. Leonidas stood for a law and a nation, but our next warrior fought for the life of one man, and he didn't have a mountain pass to help him. In 197 AD, during the collapse of the Han dynasty, the warlord Cao Cao was ambushed in his own camp at Wancheng. At this time, Cao Cao was the most powerful man in China, a ruthless visionary who was the only force capable of reunifying a fractured nation. His death would have plunged the empire into another century of total anarchy. The surprise was total. While Cao Cao was distracted, a rival general named Jiang Shu launched a midnight raid. As the tents burned and the assassins closed in, the only thing standing in their way was Cao Cao's personal bodyguard, Dian Wei. Dian Wei was a man of legendary strength, but as the fight began, he realized his signature weapons, a pair of heavy twin halberds, had been stolen by a traitor earlier that night. Undeterred, Dian Wei seized a common soldier's spear and stepped into the narrow entrance of the camp. He became a human bottleneck. Because the passage was so tight, the assassins could only face him a few at a time. And for every man that stepped forward, Dian Wei sent a corpse back. Records state that he killed over a dozen men in the initial rush, but the sheer volume of the assault was too much. His spear, notched and soaked in blood, finally snapped under the weight of the bodies. Most men would have surrendered. Instead, Dian Wei did the unthinkable. According to the official historical records of the era, Dian Wei reached into the pile of the fallen and seized 2 enemy soldiers by their legs. Using their bodies as literal human clubs, he swung them with such terrifying strength that he struck down nearly 10 more attackers in a single, desperate burst. Dian Wei was eventually turned into a pincushion of spears and arrows. When he finally took his last breath, he died as he had fought, standing upright, blocking the path with his own frame. He held the line so effectively that even after he was dead, the attackers were reportedly too terrified to approach his body. They simply stood there, watching a ghost guard the gate. In 1576, the heart of India became the stage for one of the most lopsided battles in history. The Mughal Emperor Akbar sought to crush the final pocket of Rajput resistance led by Maharana Pratap. At the narrow mountain pass of Haldighati, Pratap stood with 3,000 horsemen against a Mughal force of over 10,000. Pratap didn't just hold the pass, he launched a desperate, thunderous cavalry charge aimed directly at the heart of the Mughal command. Mounting his legendary stallion, Chetak, Pratap became a blur of blue and silver, cutting a path through the center of the Mughal line. This wasn't a blind rush, it was a calculated strike. As the lines buckled, Pratap caught sight of the enemy general, Man Singh, perched high in a reinforced howdah atop a massive war elephant. Realizing that taking down the general was his only path to victory, Pratap spurred Chetak toward the beast. According to the official war diaries, the stallion performed an almost impossible feat of animal bravery. In the heat of the slaughter, Chetak reared up, planting its forehooves directly onto the elephant's trunk, elevating Pratap to eye level with the general. From this elevated position, Pratap hurled a heavy spear. The spear missed the general but killed the driver, sending the massive animal into a blind, trampling panic. For a few frantic minutes, the superior Mughal numbers meant nothing, as their lines were crushed by their own panicked war beasts. The charge failed to kill the general. Pratap was soon surrounded and bleeding from multiple wounds. In a final act of devotion, the wounded Chetak carried his king out of the slaughter, leaping over a wide river to secure Pratap's safety before the horse finally collapsed and died. Pratap lost the field that day, but he refused to surrender his crown. He spent the rest of his life as a guerrilla king, a living symbol of a defiance that the Mughal Empire could never truly break. In 12th century Japan, loyalty was often valued above life itself, and nowhere was this more evident than in the bond between the warrior monk Benkei and the samurai Yoshitsune. Benkei was a man of towering stature, reportedly over 6 feet tall. He was an imposing figure, even in an era of giants. He was not only a formidable fighter, but the unwavering protector of his master. Their story reached its tragic climax in the summer of 1189 at Koromogawa Castle. Cornered and vastly outnumbered, Yoshitsune retreated into the inner sanctum. To buy his master the time to preserve his honor, Benkei stepped onto the narrow bridge leading to the gate. He stood alone against an army 500 strong. According to the official chronicles, Benkei became a literal wall of steel. Carrying 7 different weapons, he cut down over 300 soldiers who tried to storm the bridge, his massive naginata clearing the path with every sweep. For several agonizing hours, Benkei functioned as a human barricade. He wielded his blade with a mechanical, tireless rhythm, utilizing the bridge's bottleneck to negate the enemy's massive numerical advantage. This gruesome display of endurance shattered the morale of the elite troops, who found themselves unable to bypass a single man. Terrified by his reach, the army stopped charging. Instead, they rained volleys of arrows upon him. Benkei stood unmoving as hundreds of shafts pierced his armor. The defense lasted from the first light of dawn until the ritual in the castle was complete. By the time the final volley was fired, Benkei had stood his ground for nearly half a day. When the sun began to set and the firing ceased, the soldiers noticed something haunting. Benkei was still standing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't until a group of cavalry finally dared to charge that they realized the truth. Benkei had been dead for some time. His muscles had locked in place by rigor mortis and sheer willpower, allowing him to guard the bridge even after his heart had stopped beating. In the autumn of 1066, the Viking Age reached its violent conclusion on a wooden bridge in northern England. The Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, had invaded with a massive fleet, but at Stamford Bridge, his army was caught completely off guard. They were unarmored, divided by the river, and facing a rapid response force led by the English king. As the English army thundered toward the crossing, the Norsemen scrambled to form a shield wall on the far bank. But they were seconds away from being overrun. To buy his brothers the time they needed to survive, one man, a nameless berserker of enormous stature, stepped onto the narrow planks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle identifies this moment as the turning point of the morning. Standing at the center of the narrow wooden span, the lone Norseman wielded a Dane axe, a massive two-handed weapon capable of shearing through mail armor and shields with a single downward stroke. For 60 minutes, this anonymous warrior turned the bridge into a meat grinder. Because the bridge was only wide enough for 2 or 3 men to stand side by side, the English army's advantage of 15,000 soldiers was completely neutralized. The records state he personally felled at least 40 elite English housecarls. To maintain this defense for an hour, he would have had to neutralize an opponent roughly every 90 seconds. By mid-morning, the base of the bridge was so obstructed by fallen soldiers and shattered shields that the English infantry struggled to even find footing. The English were paralyzed. A frontal assault was proving impossible. In a move of desperate, underhanded strategy, a soldier found a wooden tub and floated beneath the bridge. Peering through the gaps in the floorboards, he used a long spear to thrust upward, striking the giant in the only place his weapon couldn't reach. The warrior fell, but his task was complete. He had held a kingdom at bay long enough for the Viking line to solidify. While the Norsemen would eventually lose the battle, the delay caused by this one man exhausted the English army so thoroughly that they were defeated just 3 weeks later by William the Conqueror. He is the ultimate proof that a single person in the right place at the right time can alter the course of history. History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by those who simply refused to move. Whether it was a Viking on a bridge or a king in the surf, these stands remind us that numbers only matter, until they meet a man who has decided that today is not the day he yields. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most unbreakable warriors, hit the like button and subscribe to Echoes of Antiquity for more stories from the front lines of the past. Which of these stands do you think was the hardest to believe actually happened? Let me know in the comments below. We'll see you in the next one.